Welcome back to Art Crime International. I'm RJ, and let's start off the episode with a happy, or maybe not so happy, New Year to you all. For my UK listeners, I hope your lockdown 3 is going well. I spent it making this video, which is a plus, and going to the supermarket when they open to avoid people. So I've had a great lockdown. For my US listeners, I hope you've recovered from the absolute shock, which was the coup attempt. The more I hear about it, the more angry I get. Patriotic white men have a lot to answer for, historically and in the present. For my international listeners, I hope that your government's tackling of any major problems that you're facing right now has been more successful than the dumpster fires of the UK and the US, and that their problems can give you some solace that at least you are not in either country right now. This month's episode is going to be a little different, as it technically isn't an open and shut case of crime, where someone has done something illegal and has gone to jail, but instead I wanted to talk about discrimination in the visual arts. In honour of World Braille Day on the 4th of January, I thought I would have a look into how visually impaired artists are received in the art market and of the general accessibility provided by the art world to visually impaired viewers. So, due to this, today's episode will be split into two parts, one tackling artists and the other tackling viewers. Hopefully it will not be a two-part episode, but I guess I shall see how long the script becomes. I'm hoping that it isn't. I don't think it will be, but I guess we'll see. A side note for this and future episodes, I will be trying to be more descriptive with some of the works that I discuss so that any visually impaired individuals who can't look up the pictures that I have linked on my Instagram in order of their discussion can get an idea of what I'm talking about. If anybody has any feedback on those descriptions, that would also be greatly appreciated. You can reach me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and on YouTube, however you feel more comfortable. For this episode's recreation, I will be remaking Monet's Japanese bridge pictures from his Garden in Da Vinci. I think that's how you pronounce it. I won't go into detail about why specifically this picture, as it will be discussed later on, but I will highlight my approach. Whilst I've been researching for this episode, I've discovered a lot of different accessible implements that museums sometimes have for visually impaired viewers, such as tactile recreations of the works, which are layered composition pictures that the viewer can touch to feel the difference between certain layers in a painting, 3D miniatures of the artwork, usually sculptures, and audio descriptions. I'm going to try to combine some of these tactics in my recreation, as well as doing the work whilst being visually impaired, which for me basically means taking my glasses off, as I can't see in clear detail further than a few inches from my face. So hopefully this will provide me with a similar experience to some of the artists that I will be talking about. However, do not take this as me trying to say that I am severely visually impaired or blind, as I am not. All of my artistic materials will be listed below, but I will be adding annotations if editing RJ remembers, as some of the materials I will be using are a little bit uncommon to try and get the best tactile portrait I can think of, which I will explain further later on. As always, all of my research resources will be listed below, and if you have any thoughts, please reach out to me. Also, I am not a doctor or an eye expert in the slightest. I'm a history of art and history major, so if I get any medical information wrong when talking about particular issues for some of these artists, please let me know. I've also been highlighting one blind artist for the entirety of January on my Instagram if you want to head over there for further discussions or to learn more about other artists that I don't mention in this episode. Now, let's get into some discrimination. Part 1. Visually impaired artists. Now, for those of you listening who may be able-bodied, sighted individuals, you may not really think very much about whether the artists that you are viewing have a different visual experience than you. In some respects, it may be easier to recognise the different experiences of an artist that is of a different race, gender, sexuality, or nationality from you, potentially due to the content, context, or materiality of their work. You would not be the only one. Admittedly, I have never really put much thought into whether the artists I have viewed in different institutions were visually impaired, and how that may have affected their work, unless it is specifically stated in the description, and personally, I wouldn't blame you for not knowing anything about this, as I certainly wasn't really taught about it either. Doing a quick Google search of blind artists will bring up a few articles, with similarly clickbaity titles like 10 artists that you didn't know were visually impaired, or 10 blind artists the market loves right now. However, many Many of these articles are very unsubstantial in their content, especially when it comes to older artists. Although it is easy to know in our current art market, due to jumps in medical diagnosing, whether an artist is visually impaired, what their diagnosis is, if they choose to discuss it, and how it may affect them from a quick internet search, for some older artists, from the Renaissance to even the 1980s, it can be difficult to know for sure that their artistic style was a decision and not an outcome of an undiagnosed visual impairment. Personally, I was shocked with some of the information from these clickbaity articles, and from further research done by ophthalmologists, the eye doctors, on some of these artists, with the theories of who they believe may have had a visual impairment. There was a theory put forward by ophthalmologist German Beretins that El Greco's elongated forms in his portraits, making his individuals look long, lanky, and like 8 foot tall, may be due to astigmatism, which affects the cornea in your eye. Rather than being a circle, it would be more of a watermelon shape, which would bend the light it receives in different amounts and affect how focus lines and contours were, exaggerating or stretching objects in a person's vision. This theory has since been dismissed, as if astigmatism was the cause, the canvas would also be stretched in El Greco's vision, meaning that the painting of the stretched figure in his vision on the stretched out canvas would cancel each other out, and the other works by him highlight his lack of astigmatism, meaning the elongation of his portraits was most likely a stylistic choice. This example highlights how difficult it can be to know for sure if some of these theories are true or not. Before I cover some proven examples, let's run through some other artists and their possible visual impairments. This is not to say that the theories presented below aren't true. I just don't have enough proof to say for sure that it is true, but all of these examples have been taken from a Perkins School for the Blind article and are all cited from a verified source. Firstly, let's begin with the master himself, who seems to make a feature in every episode on this channel, Leonardo da Vinci, which has the most limited information, largely due to the distance between his active time and our current time. It has been suggested that Leonardo may have had intermittent exotropia. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but I think that's right. A condition where the eyes usually present as normal, but sometimes one eye will turn outwards. This theory was drawn from some of Leonardo's portraits, where he paints some of the eyes of his sitters in this position. How accurate this is, and whether the eyes in his portraits were just part of his style, is unknown and will probably remain that way. Next we have Guercino, a 17th century Italian Baroque artist, who is named after the Italian word for squinter, Guercini. In comparison with Leonardo, we have a little bit more evidence than just basing his potential condition on the unusual facial features in his paintings, as his biographer states that apparently Guercino developed strabismus suddenly one night, leaving his right eye permanently turned inwards, causing him to squint, or at least look like it, and earn the nickname of Guercino. Similarly, there are discussions that Pablo Picasso may have suffered from the same condition, and that Cubism may have been spurred by his lack of depth perception for 3D objects, and that he preferred to do 2D works using shading, perspective, and occlusion. However, this is more unsubstantiated than Guercino's diagnosis, as it is difficult to tell with artists whether it is an artistic choice or an outcome of visual impairment, which becomes a common theme throughout this episode. This next one I personally found the most interesting, as there are neurologists who believe that Francis Bacon's art style, where he elongated his figures, like in his Pope series, which makes them look horrifying and manic as if the person is rocking up and down in their chairs, may be due to a brain condition called dysmorphosia, which affects a person's ability to perceive objects, causing them to constantly be changing or appearing to move to the viewer. I fully understand that I've probably mispronounced that, so I'll try it again. Dysmorphopsia? It's one of them. It has to be. This theory was based off of a statement made by Bacon in an interview where he stated that images to him appeared to be constantly changing when talking about his art process. If he does have dysmorphopsia, there we go, a great word, it could be due to, and another tricky one, a meningomia tumour, brain injury, or carbon monoxide poisoning. But again, this theory is unproven. The last artist that is in the sort of unknown category of whether their condition was real or just an art style is Rembrandt, the famous Dutch painter, who potentially had stereo blindness, evidenced by his self-portraits, which he was prolific at doing, showing his eyes looking in different directions. With stereo blindness, the individual sees different visual images from their left and right eyes, meaning that it affects depth perception and leads the individual having to rely on light and shadow sensitivities to understand depth. Apparently his stereo blindness eventually became monocular vision, which he felt was to his benefit, as he could pick up details that his binocular vision peers couldn't, and was more in tune with the way that light and shadow worked to create 3D worlds on his canvases. So now that we've covered a few big artists that ophthalmologists have theories about, let's move on to some famous artists who may surprise you that we now know definitely had some form of visual impairment which affected their work, and talk about the impact of visual impairment on visual art. Before I start, I want you to see how many you can name that you think might be visually impaired. I'll be surprised if you get all of the individuals that I'm about to talk about, but you might get at least one. For this section, we are going to start with some more recent artists, and then leave the most surprising group until the end. One artist who you may not have realised that can be defined as being visually impaired is Clifton Pugh, a 20th century Australian artist known for his German expressionist-inspired portraits and landscapes of Australia. Unknown at the time, through genealogical research by testing his family members that are still alive, scientists have been able to largely confirm that Pugh most likely had inherited eye deficiencies, causing him to have abnormal colour vision, commonly known and mislabelled as colour blindness. Although most people may not think that colour blindness counts as a disability in the same way or to the same severity as complete blindness or cataracts, colour blindness can have a severe effect on an individual's way of living, as most things within our society in some way are colour-coded, whether for design, organisation or efficiency, and can cause issues with comprehension and exclusion from different job paths, such as learning how to fly and other jobs that heavily rely on accurate vision. From this genealogical research, scientists believe that he may have had a severe red-green deficiency, but interestingly, his work shows no signature of this, which just emphasises that as viewers and researchers, we cannot rely on an artist's work alone for our theories and need secondary evidence. Our second late 20th century artist is Georgia O'Keeffe, who suffered from macular degeneration in the 1970s when she was reaching her 80s. Due to her degeneration, she began to receive more assistance with her paintings, although she did not pay those assistants as she viewed them as a tool of her practice, like a palette knife, which is just a lovely sentiment, isn't it? Unfortunately, she's not the only one in the art market that thinks that way, and that's also another discussion for another day. She also moved into other mediums like clay to explore her art practice in a way that was easier for her to accomplish alone. Now we move into the big guns, and this is the part of my research that firstly made me question whether my degree was worth it if this was never even mentioned once, and secondly changed a part of my fundamental understanding of some of the most famous works from the 20th century. So, before I unleash this information onto you, you may want to strap in, because did you know that 4 or 5 depending on who you count, 4 or 5 out of the 7 artists that make up the Impressionists had visual impairments, mainly in their older years when some of their most experimental work was created. This research genuinely boggled my mind and made me want to read as much as I could, so let's start with the 3 that I found the least information on before moving on to the 2 that have the most written about them and arguably have the bigger impact. Firstly, we have Mary Cassatt, an American portraitist known for her depictions of female life in the late 19th and early 20th century, who was invited at the request of Edgar Degas to join the Impressionists in 1877 after her works were rejected for exhibition by the Paris Salon. Cassatt was diagnosed with cataracts, which causes the clouding of the lenses, and diabetic retinopathy, which covers any damage done to the retina of the eye. Both of these conditions made her eyesight get dimmer and dimmer, affecting the colour and sharpness of her work. Similarly to other artists of this period, Cassatt switched from oils to pastel painting in the early 1900s, alongside larger canvases, so that she could alter her art style with bolder lines and fewer colours to counteract the issues she faced with her visual deterioration. Our second artist, Auguste Renoir, is said to have had myopia, also more commonly known as short-sightedness. Although there is not much known about it, apparently he felt, from statements that have been recorded by others, that it was a benefit to him as his landscape already looked perfectly blurred to him, the artistic style he was intending, and that he didn't have to manipulate his object vision to fit his artistic vision as they were one and the same. Our third artist, who in my opinion I wouldn't categorise as an impressionist, is not what I think of first, but who was working at a similar time and did contribute towards the movement, is Paul Cézanne, most well known for his post-impressionist and cubist works alongside Pablo Picasso that influenced 20th century abstract art practice. Although we do not know for sure from secondary sources of individuals that interacted with Cézanne, there is a possibility that he may have had a chronic illness which made him weak and tired in warm climates, leading him to seek cooler climates during the summer, and that he may have had diabetes. This could have been the chronic illness, like Mary Cassatt. From what we know, he was on a special diet which could have been to regulate blood sugar, and he had reddened eyes, which could have been part of the diabetes, which can cause myopia, cataracts, weakening of muscles in the eye, retina damage, and eventually blindness. Although we are unsure how much of this is true, it could have been diabetes or old age that caused changes to interpretation of light, his technique, and his perception of objects, and may have been why he was drawn to more abstract art styles in his later years. However, as artist style is complex and relies on a lot of factors, we cannot be sure. Now let's move on to our two big guys, one who I have already mentioned before, Edgar Degas, and the other heavy hitter who I admittedly knew was blind in some way from my arts education, but not in any detail. This is the one that I think some of you may have already known, as it is usually described that his Water Lilies series was painted whilst his eyesight was diminishing, but I promise that Claude Monet's story is more interesting than that. I'll begin with Degas, who is best known for his dancing ballerina scenes from his Impressionist era, which may have come around due to his visual impairment of retinopathy, which caused damage to his retina and resulted in light sensitivity issues, driving him to work more comfortably inside. By moving inside, Degas found new places to work that inspired him, like ballets and operas, and began prolifically documenting the movements of dancers in his works. As he aged, his eyesight only got worse, meaning that by his late 50s in 1891, he could no longer read print, and began to make adjustments to his art style to accommodate his visual impairment. Similarly to other Impressionists, like Mary Cassatt, Degas moved from oil paints to pastels, which require less precision, and arguably, I think, in his work provide more movement and a more similar texture to the tutus that the ballerinas were wearing. Personally, I favour the change. Alongside this, he also took up sculpture, printmaking and photography as other artistic outputs that didn't require so much reliance on precise vision and movement. Interestingly, ophthalmologists believe that this was an inherited condition, as his maternal cousin had a similar condition and lost her sight completely by her 30s. They also believe that Degas' visual impairment may have meant that he didn't know how different his later works in pastels looked from his earlier works in oils, as the brighter colours and larger movements that he made may have looked similar to his earlier works through his own eyes. And now we move on to arguably the most famous Impressionist of all, Claude Monet, and the discussion of his Water Lily collection. Now, from my art history education, the topic of Monet being blind has been mentioned, but never really discussed, with statements that his eyesight was deteriorating, which is why his later Water Lily works became more abstracted and blurry in his paintings. However, this is not the full story and really doesn't do justice to Monet and his work. Monet's eyesight had been deteriorating significantly due to cataracts, which affected his right eye more than his left, as it usually progresses individually in each eye. We don't know exactly when his eyesight began to deteriorate, as he hated visiting doctors, don't we all, especially during COVID times, but from 1912 we have records that he did visit a doctor about his visual impairment. By 1922, when he had just agreed to paint and donate his famous Water Lily series to the French government, we know that his eyesight had deteriorated significantly, and in September of that year he had visited the best ophthalmologist in France, Dr. Charles Coutel, I think, to receive treatment, who stated that Monet was legally blind in his right eye and had only 10% vision in his left. Although surgery was recommended, he pushed hard against it until he was convinced by a friend in January of 1923 to have the iridotomy done. I will explain the surgery, but skip ahead if you're squeamish. This involves removing a layer of the iris in his right eye, which in current medical practice had started to be performed with lasers, but unfortunately for Monet, not back then. This did not resolve the issues, and 2 further operations were performed, which managed to improve his near vision, but took a little longer to work for his distance vision. Monet, who apparently was an incredibly impatient and demanding patient, did not like the recovery process of any of his surgeries, and was extremely angry when each surgery did not immediately fix his eyesight. He had various complaints that his vision had yellowed, that he could only see in yellow or blue tones, that he couldn't see yellow at all, and that he saw yellow as green and everything else as blue. Which one of these is true? We don't know. In 1924, unsatisfied with his current doctor, he found a new one, Dr. Moores, who gave him a pair of lenses designed for those recovering from cataract surgery, which improved Monet's vision substantially and allowed him to get back to his water lily works ready for donation. So you may be wondering, what does this have to do with his water lilies? Well, during this time, Monet was extremely annoyed with his vision, and its apparently constant change of colour vision, if all of his complaints are to be believed. This obviously affected his work, and some ophthalmologists have argued that the use of blue in his water lily works was to make up for the yellow colour imbalance caused by his cataracts. Although not much work from this period survived, as friends of Monet note that he destroyed many of his canvases from this time as he was unsatisfied with his work once he regained his vision, there are a few pieces that give a good indication of his deterioration. Firstly, one of his most famous works from his garden at Da Vinci, where the water lilies are based, is a picture depicting a wooden bridge overlooking the Water Lily River, with tendrils of trees coming down to meet the bridge and water lilies cluttered in groups along the surface of the river, which takes up the majority of the canvas. These water lilies are painted quickly with daubs of blue, purples and pinks, and give an impression of soft petals, in comparison with the bridge, which is very precisely painted to look strong and usable. This work was done in 1899, which from the research we have suggests that his eyesight was not deteriorating or in an intense stage of deterioration at this point. However, there is a secondary painting of this same scene, done in 1918, when we know his cataracts and vision loss would have been pretty severe, which I had never seen or heard of before, which has quite a unique and contrasting look. The entire colour palette for the same scene has been affected by Monet's cataracts, leading him to paint in a much darker palette of yellows, reds and browns. There is a possibility that these works were painted in two different seasons, like summer and autumn. But if not due to changes of seasons, I think it is most likely the cataracts. Aside from the colours, which make the whole bridge, river and trees look like they are crumbling in a fire, Monet's penmanship has suffered also, as the entire work is done in quick small strokes of paint, like it was done in a furious hurry, making it difficult to tell the bridge apart from the rest of the landscape, which is also all in the same colour palette. Although the bridge is done in a very dark brown, aspects of the landscape are also done in this dark colour, contrasted with very bright yellows, oranges and reds, which make the entire painting look warm in comparison with the colder colour palette of his previous attempt. As one of the few that survived from this period, I think this work presents an interesting contrast to Monet's later water lily collection, which he painted from the perspective of wanting the entire room in the French States Museum to feel as if the viewer was in his own garden, immersed in the water lilies. The movement that is shown in this middle period work, before his cataract surgery, is in some ways moved over into these water lilies, but in the more recognisable colour palette of the first artwork to create a tranquil, almost meditative experience of being in or on the water itself. I think at this point, now that I've discussed a few of these older artists, it's important to highlight how the art market has reacted to these works and how the conversation of visual impairment has come up in these discussions. Due to the fact that I had to go to ophthalmologists who had an interest in art to gain any information about the visual impairment of any of these artists, I think it is obvious to see that the art market and arts education does not do a good enough job at recognising and educating others on the works of the visually impaired. However, I don't know whether this is solely the fault of art historians or an issue with the way that art progresses. There is an argument to be made from the fact that the majority of the Impressionists had visual impairments, which started the process of artistic abstraction in 20th century Western art and allowed for the post-Impressionists, Cubists, Fauvists, Pointillism, Expressionism and other movements to explore outside of the realms of the narrow-minded arts education of the 19th and 20th century academies, that visual impairment could be a critical catalyst to the art of abstraction. However, aside from the few artists that we have medical records or biographers' notes for, to know whether their artistic style and experimentation was solely due to visual impairment or solely due to experimentation, or more likely the mixture of both, is hard to know. From my perspective as a student of art history and history, I think that this lack of discussion around the visual impairment of artists does a disservice to these artists and a disservice to us as viewers. From the perspective of the viewer, whether abled or disabled, I think it is important to be able to understand the mindset and capabilities of the artist when creating their works, to be able to try and place yourself within the role of the painter to get a better sense of their process. For me, knowing that Monet began to rely on the paint names on the tubes because he was struggling to tell them apart, or they looked different from what he remembered, and using his recipes from years of painting to know how much to mix to get the colour he wanted, completely changes my understanding of his artistic process within his later works, as in some cases, He was painting colours from his imagination into his observations of life in a formulaic rather than expressive manner. I also think the success of these artists in the art market presents an interesting theoretical question of whether some of these artists would have been regarded as well as they have been for so long if critics realised that these experimentations in movement, colour and line were not always considered experimentations by the artists, and more likely adaptations due to visual impairment. I think this discussion is highlighted well in the way that current audiences tend to view works by contemporary visually impaired artists, in that some viewers hold visual works to a lower standard if they know the artist is visually impaired, or discredit the meaning or experimentation of a work by a visually impaired artist as the final result is not visually pleasing to sighted audiences. This situation is highlighted best from a 1990s Polish study of an exhibition entitled City That Can't Be Seen, held in a contemporary art museum in Lublin, where a group of young, congenitally blind Polish people were brought to Lublin, an unfamiliar city to all of them, and asked to create works to be displayed about their impressions of the city. They were taken on a guided tour to look at publicly exhibited art, monuments and museums, as well as met artists and attended workshops with different materials before the works were displayed in Galeria Labyrinth. The exhibition had an educational program about the works, the lights were dimmed, and visitors were asked to experience the exhibition in a similar way to how the blind artists did, by being blindfolded and touching the pieces, which all had descriptions in Braille. According to the study, most of the reaction was positive, as many audiences couldn't believe that the works had been made by blind people, but it is hard to know how biased these individuals were, as they may have had a lower standard for visual art from blind people than sighted artists. Interestingly, from a design perspective, there are a few reflections that could be made. Most of the works were monochromatic, aside from one picture book. The blind artists focus more on abstract art fundamentals rather than making something visually beautiful. That feeling of disorientation in a new place seemed to be a common theme throughout some of the works, and that there is a visual difference in style between fully blind and other visually impaired artists, as visually impaired artists seem to have more control with the pencil and could make more recognisable shapes and use foreshortening in works, in comparison with blind artists which look more like the drawing style of a young child. The main conclusion that the creator of this project comes away with, though, is that this exhibition did help to change the audience's perspective of visually impaired art and the experience of those that are visually impaired, as well as give a huge amount of self-confidence to the visually impaired artists by having their work displayed alongside famous contemporary abstract artists. This is where I think the art world could help to change, by opening themselves up more towards visually impaired artists, and by acknowledging the visually impaired artists that they may already unknowingly display. However, this situation needs to be handled delicately to not create a situation of virtue signalling or tokenism, by including visually impaired artists as well as other disabled artists in standard exhibitions, not solely in limited exhibitions curated around disabilities. Although these types of exhibitions are also good and can be very informative if curated well, they can't be the only ones, and these artists deserve to be looked at critically in the same way as abled artists, and not be pedestaled or sidelined because of their disability, which seems to be the two modes that most museums and audiences are able to achieve at present. Part 2. Accessibility in institutions. Now that I have covered some parts of the experience of visually impaired artists in the art market, I think it is important to spend some time looking at what institutions are doing to make their exhibitions more accessible to visually impaired viewers, and how the introduction of these methods are actually viewed by the viewers it is meant for. From 2004, after the Disability Discrimination Act, which is specifically in Britain, I would presume other countries have similar laws, businesses were required to make reasonable adjustments to their buildings and sites to make themselves more accessible to disabled users, such as ramps, braille signage and widening doorways. However, most major institutions have been doing more than this bare minimum to accommodate disabled audiences, creating specific tour groups and events for visually impaired viewers, audio guides, braille maps and trained audio tour guides. Although many of these additions have been useful for visually impaired audiences, there is always room for improvement. Most accessibility tools that have been put in by institutions under the guise of trying to help disabled communities often have never consulted the group or a wide variety of the group when designing and assessing possible solutions, which is the unfortunate byproduct of discrimination within our society, that many of these individuals are not within a position of power to be consulted on or argue for better or different proposals that would better meet their needs. However, this also becomes a catch-22 in the disabled community, as some individuals then do not feel able to criticise accessibility tools that have been implemented for them, which they may not find helpful at all, for fear that the accessibility tools will be taken away and never replaced, or that they will be seen as ungrateful by these institutions. In my personal opinion, I do not feel that disabled viewers should have to feel worried about coming forward with their valid concerns with accessibility tools, and originally should have been consulted before its implementation. However, let's take a closer look at some of these accessibility features in more detail, and also at new technological advancements that may take over some of these more basic provisions in the future to make a more integrated experience for visually impaired viewers and a more immersive experience for sighted audiences also. For many visually impaired viewers, the first thing that causes an issue with the museum is their initial journey and planning to come to the museum or gallery. Unlike most sighted audiences who can decide on a whim if they want to drop into a gallery or museum on a lunch break or book a museum tour and make arrangements very easily, for visually impaired audiences, more thought and research has to be conducted before they can step out of the door. Planning their journey on public transport, does the museum have audio guides, tour guides for their visually impaired? Where do they get these resources from? Do they have to book ahead of time? Where are the main facilities, and several other questions, aside from whether there is something they want to see and do they want to go, like most sighted audiences have to consider. Once these questions have been answered, which you would hope are given in detail on the website or in information by the institutions, but in some cases can be severely lacking in detail, a visually impaired person may arrive at a museum to have their own experience with visual art. However, this experience is not always great and definitely could be supplemented a lot more than what is provided currently. Aside from the smallest adjustments that museums can make, such as braille signage on all artworks and directions and an audio guide that will take you around the works, much more can be done, especially with audio guides. Most of you may be familiar with the experience of an audio guide if you have ever been to a foreign museum that doesn't have signage in your native language. These audio guides can be great, aside from the minor lost in translation moments, depending on how well the guide is put together, but often these guides rely a lot on the person being sighted and being able to see the works that are being discussed. However, this obviously poses a problem for individuals that are visually impaired. I would presume that the audio guides that are given to the visually impaired are different from those for sighted individuals, but even on a basic level, there are some fundamental issues with an audio guide. Firstly, making an audio guide for someone who is visually impaired obviously relies on sighted individuals to make them, to be able to describe the work in some way to the listener. Although this can't really be rectified, as someone needs to be able to see the work, the way that these artworks are described, if done badly, don't take into account the capabilities and understanding of its viewer. Although the history of a piece, what materials have been used, and the different colours are great for sighted viewers, a lot of this description can be completely lost on a visually impaired person, as their knowledge or remembrance of these things may be hard to remember or non-existent depending on their memory, type of vision loss, and comprehensive ability. If an audio guide can be improved, a discussion of the mood of the work, the materials of the things being depicted, like what type of wood a table shown in the work might be made of, what could be smelt or heard in the image, if in a landscape, can help a visually impaired person to place themselves within the image and gain a better understanding of the work itself, alongside the descriptors of the colours, the artist's interpretation of the scene and the materials they've used, and the history of the work. That being said, trying to create an immersive experience is not only helpful for visually impaired audiences, but for sighted audiences as well, especially children, as it has been proven that immersive experiences tend to be more memorable to audiences than solely visual experiences. Secondly, many of these audio guides only have one setting, which is accessible to the widest majority of art viewers and are usually composed in an entry-level way to pique an interest in someone who may want to do further research or to just give a brief synopsis of the work. However, just as every sighted viewer has a different level of knowledge that they bring with them to the institution, so do visually impaired individuals. The majority of visually impaired people globally are not the stereotypically completely dark, can't see anything blind people that most people think of when they think of visually impaired people. Aside from their level of vision being widely different, from those that can't see anything to those that struggle with colour differentiation, elongation or light and shadow, many visually impaired people have not always been visually impaired either, and due to this, some of them may have enjoyed art and had that as their profession or interest before they began to experience their impairment. This means that many of these audio guides do not provide enough information to these individuals who have a strong interest in art and who may understand and remember more complex theories and histories and terminologies that are discussed within the art world. An easy fix for this would be to have staged audio guides, which have been integrated into some projects, such as a child level, general level, and a professional level, which becomes more detailed for the artwork. This, integrated into audio guides that are purposely made for the visually impaired and researched thoroughly before their implication, will be a great addition to the accessibility of many museums across the world. A secondary tool that many museums try to use are guided tours and experiences that are made specifically for the visually impaired. These can be in the form of a lecture series, a standard tour around the institution with a trained guide for the visually impaired, tours from volunteers of the institution, or small group session activities that can be booked in advance. All of these different experiences have different issues with them, but are a great step for museums to engage more openly with their visually impaired patrons, and to gather an audience that they can gather information from on how to make their museums better. Firstly, the guided tours around the institution can be helpful for individuals that want to ask more questions about certain works or want to be able to have a more personal experience in comparison with a standard recorded audio guide. However, the level of training of these individuals can be wildly different depending on the institution, and also these guides still would need to be adaptable to the individual they are guiding. There is also the issue of miscommunication or a clash of personalities between the guide and the visitor, which could cause issues with the translating of works to the visually impaired visitor if there is no other resources available to the guide or visitor to aid the conversation. This is further compounded if this guide is a volunteer who may not have experienced much training or how to translate and explore questions that a visually impaired visitor may have for them, although this can make for a more open communicative style as the visitor and guide learn together about different works and experience them together rather than as two separate experiences of the sighted guide and the impaired visitor. The second group of things that museums currently offer is lectures or smaller workshop experiences for the visually impaired. Although these sessions are a great idea in theory, some attendees have brought up a few areas that can be improved. For a lecture series, attendees feel that it would be more helpful if they received information about the artworks that would be talked about before the lecture a few days beforehand, so that they could do their own research into them to try and understand the visualization of the work before the lecture, or even to be provided with some resources that they could review before the lecture, which would be even better. Although this requires a bit of forethought by the institution, I think this is a great idea that should be considered so that the attendees can come in with some previous knowledge about the subject matter that they can develop on from the lecture series. For workshops, depending on what they cover, the main criticism that attendees seem to have is that they were set at a basic level, in a similar way to the audio guides, so that it was accessible to everyone in attendance. For some, this meant that the workshop became boring or required them to go elsewhere to find out more information or develop their skills in other places, taking their attendance away from the museum. The main criticism for both of these types of activities, however, was the fact that many institutions forget that these workshops are not solely an educational outing for visually impaired people, but are a social event in the way that these activities would be for sighted individuals, and that many people attend these activities as a way of regularly meeting friends or meeting their art friends before going for lunch or drinks. This social aspect is important to many visually impaired attendees, as they often feel like they miss out on the social aspect of regular museum attendance due to the fact that they can't see and therefore pick up on subtle movements in body language to be able to discuss works with other attendees. An example of this could be not being aware that they are breaking social etiquette within a museum by blocking the way of other viewers, or not being able to talk with another viewer about the work they are both looking at because they can't interpret whether the person next to them is open for a conversation, or even if they know that they're there. This reliance on an understanding of body language within institutions, which tend to be created as quiet, introspective viewing experiences with hush whispers to friends or family about what you've seen or thought, can be very excluding for visually impaired audiences. Now that we've talked about the options that most museums in some capacity offer and where they could improve, let's have a look at what the future could hold for museum experiences for visually impaired and sighted audiences. It has been a discussion in the museum world for the past few years about the need for modernising museology displays for the future, to make them more accessible to a wider audience through using other senses like taste, smell, touch and sound, and move away from the Victorian tradition of everything being in glass display cases, which create a barrier between the viewer and these pieces of history. Now, these theorists are not suggesting that we remove the cases completely and let everybody go free-for-all handling and licking every piece of dinosaur bone they can get their hands on, like some archaeologists, but they are suggesting bringing in touchable objects and more immersive experiences into everyday use in the museum. One big option is the use of 3D copies of sculptures that are allowed to be felt by the general public. Sometimes this can take the form of a smaller replica of the work being made, so a small metal statue of a bronze work, or more commonly now that 3D printing is more accessible, is a use of digitally scanning sculptures to make accurate 3D prints of these famous works. Aside from being useful as a tool for engaging with children, as they can play with the sculpture, as well as sighted audiences who can feel and look closer at features, it is helpful for visually impaired audiences as, when given enough time, they can feel the work through guidance to gain an understanding of the work. The use of 3D printing is very beneficial for museums, as it means that these smaller remakes can be loaned to other museums without expensive transport insurance cost for the exhibition, as well as can be easily stored in comparison with a life-size remake of the original for the purpose of touching in the same material, which can be extremely expensive to produce, or cause damage to more fragile original works when they are being examined or placed into casting materials to make the replica. However, 3D printing does have its drawbacks. For visually impaired audiences, although touching the physical features of the work is helpful, also being able to feel the materials the original work is made of and whether it absorbs heat, is smooth or cold to the touch, can be important in their comprehension of the work. This information is obviously not available to them if they are holding a plastic replica of a bronze object. However, the use of touch is now becoming a more heavily researched and implemented field within institutions, as some have created touch tours for the visually impaired with another form of object known as tactile pictures. For sighted audiences, the easiest way to explain what a tactile portrait can look like is either like a relief sculpture of the painting you wish to be felt, that the viewer can move their hand across, or it can take a different form as a 3D image made out of layered plastic, maybe like a background, middle ground or foreground, which can help provide the depth of the picture alongside the content for visually impaired audiences. Both options usually have braille or audio descriptions to go with them and are there to supplement the discussion of the work and help the viewer to understand the work, as the original paintings themselves do not provide the best touch experience for visually impaired audiences, unless they are done in multiple different materials to give some difference in texture, or in a heavy impasto style that can help a visually impaired person to distinguish shapes as they move across the work. These tactile portraits can be really helpful, but are often limited in the scope of what they cover, as they are usually implemented as a touch tour within the museum covering a specific group of works, whether that be the most popular or famous works in the exhibition, or those that have been acquired from an exhibition where tactile pictures were used alongside the original image. This can mean that the audience's experience of the museum can be quite limited to what subjects a touch tour covers. However, these tactile pictures and 3D replicas also open up a new world of possibilities when put together with technology, as some exhibitions have discovered. For example, some exhibitions have made their touchable sections interactive through the use of different sensors, either through a ring that the viewer wears that scans codes on different parts of the picture to read out more specific pieces of information, to using a smartphone app to do a similar job. Other options include having cameras that follow the motion of the viewer's hand as it travels across the object and give out information that way. Although in its infancy, these types of technologies are really fascinating and have a lot of potential to make institutions more accessible and enjoyable to everyone, not only for the visually impaired. The most interesting and expensive option that some museums have experimented with is the use of virtual reality technology to allow audiences to touch digital recreations of original works, mainly 3D works like sculptures. This technology, although it seems odd to pair with visually impaired individuals, is very interesting to explore, as VR technology is set up to give real-time feedback through whatever exoskeleton the user is wearing into the body of the user, as well as in their sight and vision. Through this, visually impaired individuals can hear and feel the work that they are touching and are able to have a more in-depth exploration of the object alongside an audio guide and feel the object in its entirety in real scale size. Aside from having similar properties for accessibility to other museums as the 3D printed replicas do, as VR digital images, I would presume, can be calibrated to different systems and shared globally. Again, I'm saying I presume this, I'm not a VR expert. It does come with the downside that it is extremely expensive at the moment to implement, requires a learning curve to be able to get used to the system, depending on the exoskeleton you're using, whether it's just gloves or whether it has to be a full system that you have to step inside of, and how it works for each wearer, and would probably be highly in demand from most exhibition attendees. Like, I can't imagine that children are not going to want to do that. It must be the most exciting thing in the world to go and step into a VR headset and get to feel things. Children are going to love it, and it's going to end up being very in demand if it does get implemented. Overall, all of these options are wonderful and are moving towards making a more accessible space, but still more can be done. As some theorists have argued, many of these options still only focus on a few senses at a time and are not fully immersive, largely ignoring the possibilities of sound, taste and smell within artworks that could be presented to audiences. An example could be making a recreation of a Parisian cafe with food from the era, music, voices, perfume and objects that visually impaired participants could sit within to gain a more rounded experience of what the picture of a particular scene is trying to represent. However, I am sure that options like this and the further development of technology will soon mean that we could sit in a digitally rendered version of this scene and eventually taste and smell all of these things without touching anything. Although all of these options provide exciting opportunities for sighted and visually impaired individuals to gain more from their experiences to these institutions, I want to highlight that it is critically important that visually impaired individuals are consulted on these new adaptive technologies to check whether they would actually be helpful before progressing further with these adaptations. Overall, my conclusions and suggestions for the art market would be that immersive experiences, whether digitally created through VR or as a physical experience, need to start becoming the norm within our institutions. Although I'm not advocating for everything to be touched and out of the cases, because I fully understand that most artifacts and artworks are fragile and can't be touched themselves, a balance needs to be struck to change the experience and atmospheres of institutions from its quiet, introspective room to a more embracive, collaborative experience where discussions are open and appreciated. Also, museums need to be better at recognising the experience of visually impaired viewers in their institutions and the contributions that visually impaired artists have made to their collections. Once some museums acknowledge this, a more open discussion about the works of contemporary visually impaired artists can be more accepted, and artists like John Bramblett can be recognised as visually impaired artists without the preconceptions that come with the terminology of visually impaired.